important chapter in terms of doing business, because we're going to have to be able to tell what people's homes are worth. And if we're going to put an offer on somebody's home, what offer is reasonable to put in. If we're going to list somebody's home for sale, what's the correct price to list their home for sale. So when we talk about appraising, we have to understand the terms of value, price, and cost. And those three things could be all the same, but they could also all be different. The value is the worth of an item at a certain time. And I always like to use the example of life jackets. A couple of weeks ago, I took my little sailboat out and we had some issues and I ended up in the water. And at that point, when I ended up in the water, the life jacket that only cost $15 in Home Depot, it's not Home Depot, in Walmart, was worth a whole lot more money when I had it once I was in the water. So the value of something is the worth of an item at a certain time. And it depends on exactly what's going on at that moment. The market value, and this is what we look at when we're trying to establish the price for a house that's for sale. This is what we're looking for, the market value. The market value is the most probable price a ready, willing, and able buyer, not forced to buy, will pay a ready, willing, and able seller, not forced to sell, with a reasonable amount of marketing time. So what makes up market value is all these things happening at once. So it's the most probable price a ready, willing, and able buyer who's not forced to buy will pay a ready, willing, and able seller not forced to sell. So if we have a buyer who's being forced to buy in a certain neighborhood, and let's say he's being forced to buy in that neighborhood in order to become a policeman in New Brunswick. You have to live in New Brunswick when you're hired. So that person might want to buy a house in New Brunswick because he's forced to live in New Brunswick. Therefore, he might pay a little bit more than market price. So it's a price that a ready, willing, and able buyer who's not forced to buy will pay a ready, willing, and able seller not forced to sell. So if you're about to lose your house through the sheriff's sale, or you've already lost your house through foreclosure and the bank is selling it, then they're forced to sell. So the price might be different than the normal market price because they're forced to sell. So we're really looking for somebody who's not forced to buy, buying from someone who's not forced to sell, and with a reasonable amount of marketing time. So if we make the price so low that somebody makes an offer and buys it right away, that's not a reasonable amount of marketing time. And if we overprice a house so much that it stays on the market for a very long period of time, that results in something lower than market value. So we need a reasonable amount of marketing time. And many times when I do price, broker price opinions for banks, on the broker price opinion, it asks me, what's the normal marketing time? And the reason is if things are selling in 3 months, prices are fairly stable. If things are selling in less than 3 months, that's a sign that prices are going up. And if things are selling in longer than 3 months, that's a sign that prices are going down. So again, a reasonable amount of marketing time is what gives us market value. Pricing exactly at the amount that it would sell in a reasonable amount of time gives us our best market value. And the last thing is our market price. Our market price is what somebody pays for a property. And sometimes people pay more than a property is worth. Sometimes they pay less. So market price can be different from market value or different from value, or it could be the same. And the last thing is cost. Cost is the cost of all the building materials and labor plus the value of the land. The cost of the improvements plus the value of the land. Again, these things can all be the same or they can be all different. The first thing we want to look at now in order to determine value is the economic characteristics of value. And if you've taken Economics 101, these are going to be the same principles to value that you find in Economics 101. And it spells out a nice little word, which means it's a great multiple choice question. So the economic characteristics of value are demand, utility, scarcity, and transferability. Those are the economic components of value. economic of that characteristics of value of everything, real or personal. And it spells out dust. So it's a great multiple choice question. Demand, utility, scarcity, and transferability. The first one is demand. Demand is the need or desire to have something, but it has a second component. And that second component is the availability of capital to satisfy that desire or need. In 2008, when we had the market crash, part of the reason it crashed is there was no money available for people to buy homes with. All the lending had dried up. So again, there was no demand, and that drove prices down. Everybody still wanted a house, so the need or desire was still there, but there wasn't capital available to satisfy that desire or need. And again, that was the reason we're in a strange market now, is even though credit is very inexpensive and interest rates are at record lows, it's getting harder to borrow the money. Borrowers have to be better and better qualified. The next one is utility. And utility says it's the power to render a service or fill a need. And real estate renders a service. It keeps the rain off your head. It also is a good indicator of how much wealth you're going to accumulate in your lifetime. In Rich Dad, Poor Dad, the quote is that the earlier you buy your first house, the greater your wealth will accumulate over your lifetime. So utility is the power to render a service or fill a need. If something has no use, it will have no value. And again, real estate has a use. The next thing is scarcity, and that's old-fashioned supply and demand. So scarcity is considered in relationship to supply and demand. So right now, in the $300,000 price range, prices are going up. And the reason they're going up is there's not very many houses on the market. So every single $300,000 buyer that I've been showing houses to in the last month has lost out to multiple offers on all those properties going way above full price. And that's because we have a scarcity of homes in that $300,000 price range. So scarcity is considered in relation to supply and demand. How scarce something is may affect its value. The next one is transferability. Transferability is the physical mobility, which we don't have in real estate, in real property, but also the possession and control of rights of ownership. So the fact that when you own a house, it is very difficult for someone to take it away means it's got a very good degree of transferability. When you buy it, you can rest assured that someone is not going to come up to you with a superior claim and take it away. And we accomplish a high degree of transferability by purchasing title insurance, because purchasing title insurance insures the value of our house against somebody with a superior claim trying to take it away. And when you have title insurance coupled with a bargain and sale deed with covenants against grantors' acts, we're said to have marketable title. So we achieve our transferability with real estate with title insurance and with a bargain and sale with covenants against grantors' acts. And that degree of transferability is an element of value. Okay, so those are the economic characteristics of value as they apply to everything. Now we're going to talk about some concepts that apply specifically to real estate, or principles of value as they apply specifically to real estate. The first one is the principle of supply and demand, and we all know that. When there's no $300,000 houses on the market, that means the supply is very low. That means prices are going to go up. If there is a glut of homes on the market, like there were in 2012 and 2013, from foreclosed properties coming on the market, prices were heading down because there was an oversupply. That's the first principle of value. The second principle of value is the principle of change. The principle of change says that all real estate is in a cycle: growth, stability, decline, and renewal. Again, growth, stability, decline, and renewal. When you first build something, it starts to go up in price. That's growth. When it gets to a peak, That's stability. The price level's off. When it gets old or it's nearing the end of its useful life, you have decline and the values go down. And when the value of the real estate, or the value of the real property falls, so that the value of the land and the improvements and the building is the same thing as just the value of the land, well, then you have renewal, because then you're going to tear the house down and build a new house. In North Edison, any house that has a lot that's 20,000 square feet, they buy it, they tear down the house, and they put up a new mini mansion. So that's growth, stability, decline, and renewal. And all types of real estate have different cycle lengths. The cycle length for a single family home is very long. The cycle length for a co-op is much shorter. So again, it depends what kind of real estate you buy, how quickly that cycles. The next one is the principle of substitution. The principle of substitution says that something is only worth what something else of equal value can be easily substituted in its place. As an example, if you go to one Dunkin' Donuts and you get a medium-sized coffee, it's $2. What's it worth? Well, it's worth the fact that you can go to another Dunkin' Donuts and get another medium-sized coffee for $2. So one is only worth what another one can be easily substituted in its place for. And we use the principle of substitution when we're doing a comparative market analysis with single-family homes. Your home is only worth what another home can be easily substituted in its place for. The next one is the principle of highest and best use. This is a little confusing. It says that you have found the highest and best use when the use gives you the highest value. And if your use is not giving you the highest value, then you do not have the highest and best use. And again, an example of this is my building in Highland Park. It was built in the 1890s. As a single family house, it's only worth $289,000. But a single family house is not the highest and best use. It's on a main road, it's got a parking lot. So the highest and best use is as an office. And as an office, it's worth $389,000. So we have found our highest and best use because that's what gives us the highest value. The next one is the principle of increasing and decreasing returns. And the principle of increasing and decreasing returns states that your real estate might be giving you a stream of income. And if that stream of income, you have a single family house, and that stream of income can be increased or improved by adding another bedroom, then it might be worth adding the other bedroom because it's going to increase the amount of income you're getting. But if the cost of adding that bedroom cannot be recovered by increasing the rent, or cannot be recovered by sufficiently increasing the rent, then you have reached a decreasing return. So that's the principle of increasing and decreasing returns. The next one is the principle of contribution. So many times I will have someone who will say to me, this year especially, I want to put an in-ground pool in my backyard because we're locked down for COVID-19. Is it worthwhile to put an in-ground pool in my backyard? Well, the principle of contribution says that it's going to cost you $25,000 to put that in-ground pool in your backyard, but it's only going to add $15,000 of value to your house. So the principle of contribution says when you do an improvement, and an improvement means adding to the physicality of your real estate, that it may not add as much value as the cost of the improvement. So why would somebody put an in-ground pool in their backyard? Well, they might do it because we're all locked down for Corona and they want to have some place to entertain their family during this lockdown. That's the principle of contribution. The next one is the principle of competition. The principle of competition states that excess profits bring about excess competition, and excess competition ruins the profits for everybody. So a few years ago, when prices were down, you could pick up a house, do some repairs, and we see these shows on TV all the time. You could do the repairs and then flip the house for a profit. And as those shows proliferated on TV, And as flippers invaded the real estate market, all of a sudden, they didn't make any money anymore because there was excess competition. So the principle of competition says that excess profits bring excess competition, and excess competition ruins the profits. The next one is the principle of conformity. And the principle of conformity states that when all things are the same, they have the highest value. As humans, our brains are wired to feel more comfortable with things that are familiar. So the principle of conformity says that when you're going to build a development of 500 houses, you're going to build all the same style of houses. They're all going to be colonials. You're not going to have a colonial, a bi-level, and a ranch, because then it's not conformity. Then they're not the same, and that would hurt the values. The next thing that we want to look at is the principle of anticipation. Sometimes profits are driven by the anticipation of a future event. Sometimes extra value is added by the anticipation of a future event. In North Brunswick, there is a fabled train station that's being built. And the fact that that fabled train station is going to be able to get people into Manhattan in less than an hour by the train has added value to all the houses in that neighborhood. That's the principle of anticipation. Sometimes the anticipation of a future event will add value. The next thing is the principle of plottage. The principle of plottage in New Brunswick states that if you've got a 50 by 100 lot and you buy the house next door that's on a 50 by 100 lot and you tear it down, and you buy the house next door that's on a 50 by 100 lot and you tear it down, and you buy the house next door that's on a 50 by 100 lot, now you've got 4 50 by 100 lots or a 200 by 150 lot. And what happens then is you're able to build a more substantial type building on it, and so that the value of all of them put together is more than the sum of its parts. That's the principle of plottage. Sometimes it's also called the principle of assemblage. You're assembling smaller pieces together to get a larger piece. Other considerations are things like social considerations. I have a property now that's listed on Route 518 in Franklin Township, but it has a Princeton mailing address. Why does it have a Princeton mailing address? Because saying Princeton implies that it's special. Therefore, it adds some value. Even though it's really located in Franklin Township and the schools are Franklin Township, it has a Princeton mailing address to add prestige. Another consideration is physical considerations, the layouts of the streets and the roads. A really important example of this is in Sayreville, where Main Street and Washington Avenue come together. There's a neighborhood there that's called Tangletown. It has Quaid Street on it and Albert Street on it. In Tangletown, the streets aren't perpendicular and parallel. The streets are laid out like somebody threw a pot of spaghetti against the wall, and all of curves and recurves are how the streets are laid out. And those physical considerations detract from value. The next one is economic considerations. When I do my BPOs, my broker price opinions for banks, they ask me, how is the economy? How is unemployment? Because very high unemployment could end up leading to lower home prices. As an example, on Vineyard Road in Edison in Route 1, there used to be a Ford plant that made Ford Ranger pickups. And people who did not graduate from high school could make $100,000 a year assembling Ford pickups. They tore down that Ford plant a few years ago, and they put up in place a BJ's and a couple other little shops and strip mall. Nobody there is making $100,000 a year. Therefore, the immediate neighborhood suffered in terms of pricing, because the people who wanted to live close to the Ford plant to make $100,000 a year could no longer afford to live in the neighborhood. So economic considerations go into the value of real estate. The next one is governmental considerations. How high the taxes are. And we all know East Brunswick and Highland Park have very high taxes. That ends up hurting the value of the property. How good the schools are. My favorite example of how good the schools are is if you live in 08820, which is North Edison, you go to J.P. Stevens High School, one of the top 50 high schools in the country. If you live in 08817, South Edison, you go to Edison High School. Not such a great high school. So the houses in North Edison, the same size house, is worth 30% more than in South Edison because of governmental considerations and the schools. All right, so those are all things that an appraiser has in his brain when he's appraising a property. And he's going to make notations of all of those things. So the appraisal process itself is always a question on the test. And the way the appraisal process itself works is step number one is to define the problem. Why am I doing this appraisal? Am I doing it because it's an estate and you have to sell it quickly? Am I doing it because we want to put it on the market and put it in the MLS and we have a reasonable amount of marketing time? Am I doing it because we want to find out what your house was worth 10 years ago when you inherited it? So step number one is to define the problem. Step number two is to inspect the neighborhood and the subject property. Now, when you're talking about doing appraisals and you mention subject property, if you want to look like you know what you're talking about, the subject property is always the property that you are appraising. You don't call it the house or the home. It's the subject property. That's the property you're appraising. So you're going to inspect the neighborhood and you're going to inspect the subject property. How many bedrooms, how many bathrooms, all the different facts that go into it. You're going to collect the pertinent data about what things in the neighborhood sold for, what's the value of different amenities or different comparable things in houses, what's the taxes on the houses, all the pertinent data you're going to collect. And then a real appraiser will apply each of the three approaches to value. And we're going to go over those three approaches to value in just a moment. Next thing is we're going to correlate the value estimate. So we're going to apply each of the three approaches to value, and then we're going to correlate the value estimate. Notice, it does not say average. It does not say throw out the highest and average the other two. It says correlate. And that's because the appraisal process is subjective. It is an opinion. It is not a finding of value. It's an opinion of value. And correlate means you're going to look at the three value estimates and you're going to decide which one has the most application to the current property. And then the last thing you're going to do is prepare the appraisal report and prepare your narrative of why you priced it at that price, why you suggested your opinion of value to be that number. Now, again, a good multiple choice question. Define the problem, inspect the neighborhood and the subject property, collect the pertinent data, apply each approach to value, correlate the value estimate, and prepare the appraisal report. So the question should be, what are the three approaches to value? And the three approaches to value are the sales comparison approach, the income approach, and the cost approach. Those are the three approaches to value. Each one has its own application that is most suitable. For instance, the sales comparison approach, which uses the principle of substitution, something is only worth what something can be easily substituted in its place for, is best used for single-family homes, condos, and co-ops where there's a lot of the same thing. And we want to have similar location, similar time, and similar utility. When I do BPOs for the bank, they tell me they all have to be within a mile of each other. If I'm using closed sales, the closed sales all have to be within 6 months of each other. The utility says they all have to be about the same size and the same number of bedrooms and baths. All part of the sales comparison approach. Now, on the sales comparison approach, we have three rules that we have to remember. And the three rules are, one, never touch the subject. And we remember the subject is the property we're appraising. Rule number two is I for I, increase for inferiorities. And rule number three is S for S, subtract for superiorities. So as we're using the comparable sales method, we are going to have to make adjustments to the comparable sales, never touch the subject. And we're going to make adjustments with I for I, increase for inferiorities, and S for S, subtract for superiorities. And the reason we have to make those adjustments is no two houses are exactly alike. Even if they look very similar, maybe they haven't been maintained the same, or maybe somebody added a bathroom. So again, we have to make adjustments in order to make them similar to the subject. And here is what a appraisal looks like on our property. As we can see, the subject property is 5 BB Avenue in Spotswood. This is a property that should close on Wednesday. Our data was visual on this because it wasn't in the MLS. It has a suburban location. Its ownership is fee simple. Excuse me. Its lot size is 9,375 feet, has average curb appeal. What do you see in front of the house? Just a street, no industrial applications. Its design is a split level. This Q4 is a quality of construction rating that Fannie Mae puts out. It gives a Q1 through Q6, and you kind of look at their guidelines, and this was a Q4. They also have a condition rating that's C1 through C6. This was a house that was in good shape because it was rehab, so it's a C2. It was built in 1958, 7 total rooms, 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths. It's 1,654 square feet. It's got a 551 square foot basement. It has functional utility, which means does everything in it work and none of it is outdated or outmoded. It has forced hot air and central air conditioning. Has a 1-car attached garage. Has a fence, no pool, no fireplace, and nothing else special we want to talk about. That's our subject. And now we have our first comparable. So we see that our comparable sold for $378. And we got that information from Garden State MLS. This is Central Jersey MLS, I'm sorry. It sold on 1/10/2020. So that was within 6 months when I did the report. There was $15,000 in sales concessions. Total days on market was 53. It had a price change 20 years ago. It was suburban. It was fee simple. Lot size was 12,500 square feet, not a whole lot bigger than 93. Average street, split, Q4, C2, 1973. No adjustments so far, but we get to the total rooms, and there was 8 rooms and 4 bedrooms. So that is superior. So when it is superior, S for S, we subtract. So our comparable was superior. So we subtracted $7,500 from the sales price. Also, our gross living area was larger. It was 2,000 feet compared to 1,600. And so we did the math. We got the number of dollars per square foot. We multiplied that by 500 or so, and it came out to about $93.50. Again, it was a superior, so we had to subtract. And we have a bigger basement, superior, so we had to subtract. Also, it had a 2-car garage, superior, so we had to subtract. So that's typically how a appraisal works. Okay, and as you see, as we get down to the bottom, we have a adjusted sales price of the comparables. So by making these adjustments, we make the property similar to the subject. And remember, rule number 1 was never touch the subject. So if you look over here all the way to the left, we didn't make any adjustments to the subject because rule number 1 is never touch the subject. All right, the next approach is the income approach. The income approach goes over the present value of a stream of income. And the formula for the income approach is the net operating income divided by the cap rate. I have somebody giving me information about a commercial property and how we're going to value that commercial property. It's part offices, it's part apartments. We're going to do it by the income approach. That building is worth the stream of income it generates after all the expenses. So our value by income is our net operating income divided by the cap rate. And this is best used for income producing properties. So we got a question. What's the NOI and what's the cap rate? The NOI is the income, and that's rent, less any vacancy factors, because there's always some kind of a vacancy factor. less expenses, and expenses are things like utilities or taxes. Those are expenses or management fees, but you do not include debt service. So in NOI, we do not use debt service. We do not use mortgage payments. We do not use how much you owe on the property. Why? Because how much you owe on the property has nothing to do with what it's worth to me. How much you owe on it has to do with your equity, but it has nothing to do with what it's worth. So we do not use debt service in an NOI. We also do not use reserves for capital improvements in our NOI. A reserve for a capital improvement would be if you're putting money aside in a fund to eventually pave the driveway. That does not add value to the property until the driveway is paved. And the cap rate in our formula can be considered to be the cost of money or the amount of return that you want to get. So the cap rate in the formula is either the cost of money or the amount of return that you want to get in a property. So our net operating income, again, is our income minus vacancy factors, less expensive, exclusive of debt service, divided by the cap rate. And if our cap rate is 8%, we write it as 0.08. If it's 7%, we write it as 0.07. 6% is 0.06. And the cap rate can be determined by the census of properties. Every income producing property has to complete an income and expense return to go to the municipality. So if they take all of those together and they add them up, put them on a gigantic formula, they can come up with a cap rate. And typically your cap rate for an apartment building is 7%. Your cap rate for maybe a retail space might be 6%. And again, the cap rate is just the economic function of that formula. Value by income is equal to net operating income divided by the cap rate. So if you think about it for a second, let's go back to our formula, because this is always a question that's on the test. If our cap rate gets lowered, if our expected return gets lowered, it's on the bottom side of the equation over here. It is the denominator on the equation over here. If our cap rate goes down, it has an inverse relationship to value by income. The income goes up. If our cap rate goes up, then our value by income goes down. It's an inverse relationship. Cap rate goes down, value goes up. Cap rate goes up, value goes down. And let's continue to look at the formula. If your NOI goes up, your value by income goes up. If your NOI goes down and everything else stays the same, your value by income goes down. That's why it's so important for landlords to raise their rents, because if their expenses go up and they don't raise their rent, the value of their building goes down. So again, very important. The next approach to value is the cost approach. And we use the cost approach for things like churches, because they don't have income and they don't have a lot of comparable sales, or historic buildings, because they don't have income, they don't have a lot of comparable sales, government buildings, because they don't have income, very unique buildings that were designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. We might want to use the cost approach on that. And when we're going to do the cost approach, the very first step we're going to use is we're going to decide whether we're going to use reproduction cost or replacement cost. Reproduction cost is the cost to reproduce a replica, an exact duplicate. Replacement cost is the cost to produce a similar utility structure with current materials and current building techniques. So I had a 1949 Plymouth, and when parts were broken on it, if I wanted to get the original parts, the original part that they put in the car when they produced it, it was much more expensive. That's reproduction cost. If I wanted to put a battery in the car and I wanted to buy a current battery out of Sears, that's replacement cost. The battery did the same thing, but it's the current materials and the current construction techniques of the battery. So reproduction cost is going to be higher. It's the cost to reproduce an exact duplicate. Replacement cost is going to be lower. It's the cost to produce a similar utility structure with current materials and current building techniques. The next thing you have to do is you have to subtract any depreciation. And the term we use is accrued depreciation. And that's loss in value due to any cause. So we got to think about this for a minute in the cost approach. You're trying to value a building by cost approach. You have to build an imaginary building if you're going to do replacement cost that has similar utility but is using current materials and current designs. You're going to build an imaginary building. And when you build that imaginary building, in your mind, for instance, if you're valuing a church, you're going to build a church in your mind, but the original church might have been built in 1865. And you don't want to build the new church in your mind the same way they built that 1865 church because it would be way too expensive. So you might decide you're going to do a replacement value with current materials and current building techniques. So the next thing we have to add, we have to look at accrued depreciation and subtract the values from accrued depreciation. And there's 3 types of depreciation we look at. This is not tax depreciation. We are not depreciating the value for our taxes. This is depreciation that comes from the building wearing out or being outdated or outmoded or causes outside of the building reducing value. So in our accrued depreciation, the first one is physical deterioration. How much wear and tear the building has. How far along is it in its life cycle? If a building, we talked about the principle of change before, if that life cycle is 100 years and you're on year 75, that means you only have 25% of the value left in the building. So physical deterioration is wear and tear, how much repairs have to be done, or how far along is it in its life cycle. The next thing we have to subtract is functional obsolescence, how outdated or outmoded it is. And remember, both physical deterioration and functional obsolescence can be corrected. Functional obsolescence means you might have a church building in Perth Amboy that only has 1 bathroom in the entire church and has the sanctuary on the 2nd floor where you've got to climb 20 steps to get to it. Well, that's functionally obsolete. It's outdated or outmoded. And both of those things could be corrected. You could change how you get into the building, or you could add bathrooms. So functional obsolescence can be corrected. The last form of accrued depreciation is external obsolescence. And external obsolescence is the loss in value from an outside source. So on this church that I valued in Perth Amboy, one of the things that affected its value, and this church was built in 1865, was there was no parking lot, no place to park. And in 1865, that wasn't a big deal because everybody brought their horses. So now it is a big deal. So the fact that there's no parking is external obsolescence. Not necessarily that the church doesn't have a parking lot, but there's no parking on the streets anywhere around the church. External obsolescence. That's a loss in value from an outside source. Another common form of external obsolescence that shows up on the test is when Governor Christie was first elected. There were several towns, when he was elected governor, there were several towns in New Jersey who did not have their own police department. And so Governor Christie said, that's not fair because these towns are getting a free ride from the state police. So he immediately passed a law or issued an edict that said the state police will no longer answer calls in those towns that did not have their own police department. And that reduced the value of all the properties in those towns. And that's an example of external obsolescence. And that's almost the exact example they use on the test. What they say on the test is a town loses its paid fire department. And houses go down in value because they have no paid fire department. Well, that's a loss of value from an outside source. That's external obsolescence. And remember, we cannot correct external obsolescence. We can only correct physical deterioration and functional obsolescence. So we're back to the cost approach again. We're building this imaginary building. We've decided to do it with replacement cost. Now the question is, how do we know how much it costs us to build our imaginary building? Well, the way that we're going to find the value of the improvement, to find the value of our imaginary building, is we're going to use one of several methods. So again, first thing we're going to do is find the value of the improvement. Then we're going to subtract accrued depreciation, and that's wear and tear, functional obsolescence, and external obsolescence. And then we're going to add back in the value of the land. And that leaves us with the question of how do we find the value of the building? How do we find the value of our imaginary structure? And we do it through several ways. Number one is the quantity survey method. This is known as the stick-by-stick method or the contractor's method. In this method, you count every 2x4 you're going to need. You count every block you're going to need. You count every parcel of labor, every minute of labor you're going to need, every outlet you're going to need, and you add it all together. This is by far the method that comes up with the highest value. The next method is the unit in place method. You get an estimate for the foundation. You get an estimate for the framing. You get an estimate for the rough plumbing, the rough electrical, the roofing, and then you add all of those different segments of construction together at the end. That's the unit in place method. The next method that you could use is the square foot method. You're building a 3,000 square foot building. You know it's $170 a square foot. Therefore, it's going to cost you $340,000 to construct the building. The next method is the index method. You built that building last year, it cost you $300,000, and building materials have gone up 10%. So this year, it's going to cost you $330,000. So how do we find what it's going to cost us to build our imaginary building? Quantity survey method, unit in place method, square foot method, index method. All different methods of finding out what our imaginary building is going to cost us to do. Now, again, we find out what our imaginary building is going to cost us. So we find the value of the improvement. We look at what our imaginary building is going to cost us to build, and we look at the subject, and we say, okay, how much accrued depreciation does the subject have? How much wear and tear? How much functional obsolescence? How much external obsolescence? And then the last step was we add back in the value of the land. And the reason that's the last step is land doesn't go down in value from wear and tear or functional obsolescence. So the last step is to add back in the value of the land. Who can do appraisals? Well, in order to do an appraisal for a third party for pay, that means in order for a person to do an appraisal for a bank and get paid by the bank or get paid by the borrower, they have to have an appraiser's license. An appraiser's license takes about 150 hours in class, and you have to serve an apprenticeship. Real estate agents can do broker price opinions or comparative market analyses. So we can do BPOs or CMAs. When we do those, we must state that this is not an appraisal. Appraisals can only be done by a licensed appraiser. And we can actually charge for these BPOs, but we can only charge the person for the BPO on behalf of that person we are doing it for. In other words, if somebody says, would you give me a BPO on my house because I want to see what it's worth, you can do it. But if somebody says, I'll pay you to do a BPO on John Smith's house so he can see how much we're going to lend him, you can't do it because you're doing it for a third party for pay. In that case, only a licensed appraiser can do it. All right, so a little bit of a review. Here's a single family home. What you don't know about this home is directly behind it is a trailer park. You can kind of see some of the trailers behind you. So we would actually appraise this home in development using the comparable sales method. We would compare it to other properties in the neighborhood that have sold. But we might want to keep in mind that it has a functional obsolescence problem because it has mobile home trailers behind it. And on the other side of those mobile home trailers is the Rawway prison. So again, we might have an external obsolescence question about this property, but on just face value, we would appraise it with a comparable market analysis. We would appraise it using the principle of substitution. How do we appraise a church? So this is a church that is in Matawan. You can see it's a relatively new church, so it probably doesn't have much functional obsolescence. You can see it's got a big parking lot and it's on a nice piece of property, so it probably doesn't have much external obsolescence. It's pretty new, so it probably doesn't have any wear and tear. So we would do this church, we would appraise this with the cost approach. And we would build an imaginary building, probably a replica building that was similar in utility to this building, using one of those methods. We would subtract accrued depreciation, which we probably don't have very much of in this building, and they would add back in the value of the land. Add back in the value of the land. So for a church, we're going to use the cost approach. And then for an apartment building, what is this apartment building worth? This apartment building is worth the stream of income it generates. If you add up all the rents on all these apartments, take away a vacancy factor, then subtract your expenses, your utilities, your taxes. Remember, you do not subtract your reserves for capital improvements. And then you come up with your net operating income, and then you divide your net operating income by the cap rate. And for this building, it would probably be 7%. And that would give you your value by income. Now, there's another method to do value by income, which is not quite as accurate as the value by income, and that's called the gross rent multiplier. In the gross rent multiplier, you just take the gross rent of all the units and you multiply it by a factor. Sometimes that factor is 7 or sometimes it's 8. And that gives you a rule of thumb value of the property. The reason the gross rent multiplier is not as accurate as the value by income is the gross rent multiplier does not take into consideration extraordinary expenses. So if you look at these these apartment buildings, you can see there's no air conditioners in the windows, which means they probably have a central air conditioning system. And to have a central air conditioning system this big, they probably are not getting billed for the cold air. It's probably part of their rent. Therefore, if you were to use the gross rent multiplier, it wouldn't take into consideration the cost of producing the cold air for these units, or the warm air if it's got central heat for all the units, one gigantic boiler. So again, the gross rent multiplier is a rule of thumb. It gives you an estimated value, but it's not as accurate as the value by income. All right, again, a BPO, not an appraisal. This is what I do for a bank in order to tell them what they should sell the properties at, same property 5BB, and on the end